A very good morning, everyone. This is Karthik Sunagar from the Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Today, I will tell you how distinct ecology and evolution has shaped the venoms of India's medically most important snakes, and how this variation in snake venom affects snakebite treatment in India. I will also tell you how we are working with ITBT from the government of Karnataka to address this problem. In the Evolutionary Venomics Lab, we are mostly focused on three major aspects of venom research: venom ecology, evolution, and snakebite therapeutics. We are interested in understanding how the composition and potency of venoms is shaped by various ecological and evolutionary factors, and we are also interested in developing next generation therapeutics for the treatment of snake bites in the country. And this is because India suffers the highest rates of snakebite related mortality and morbidity globally. Over 56,000 Indians die every year from snake bites, and probably 3 times that number suffer permanent disabilities, disfigurements, and amputations. Snakebite victims are the primary breadwinners of their families. Snakebite is a major health concern in rural areas, particularly among young farmers. As a result, snakebite has a considerable impact on India's economy. Snakebite, therefore, was declared as a priority neglected tropical disease by the WHO. Snakebites are treated using an antivenom. The effectiveness of antivenom depends on the composition and activities of the biting snake species. These factors are in turn dependent on the ecology and evolution of snakes. 4 snake species in India are medically most important to humans. These are known as the big 4 snakes. India is a diverse country and harbors at least 10 distinct biogeographic zones. This includes the Himalayas, the Western Ghats, the Deccan Plateau, the deserts, semi-arid region, the Gangetic Plains, the coastal plains, the islands, and the northeast. Partly given their near countrywide distribution, 2 snakes in particular, the spectacled cobra and Russell's viper, are infamous for causing the majority of the envenomings. Completely neglecting their biogeographic histories, bites from these snakes are treated using an antivenom that is manufactured by sourcing venoms from the big 4 snakes in the southernmost part of the country. The impact of this century-old antivenom manufacturing strategy on the effectiveness of Indian antivenom, as well as the impact of distinct biogeographies on the venoms of India's medically most important snakes, has not been investigated to date. Therefore, we collected the venoms of the spectacled cobra and the Russell's viper from all the biogeographic zones where these snakes thrive. In-depth proteomics revealed very distinct venom profiles of the pan-Indian populations of the spectacled cobra and the Russell's viper. In this figure, RPHPLC venom profiles of the pan-Indian populations of the spectacled cobra are shown. Each peak represents various toxin types present in the venom of the spectacled cobra. Peak number 4 is particularly enriched with neurotoxic 3-finger toxins. This is what makes the venoms of these cobras so potently neurotoxic. As you can see, the area of peak number 4 drastically differs between populations. The venoms of some populations, such as those in the semi-arid region, the Gangetic Plain, and the Deccan Plateau, seem to be enriched with neurotoxic 3-finger toxins. And others, such as the desert population and one of the coastal populations, were constituted by very limited amounts of this toxin type. Similarly, we documented significant differences in the venoms of the pan-Indian populations of the Russell's viper. Mass spectrometry revealed finer differences in the venoms and corroborated the findings of the RPHPLC fractionation. The venoms of both the semi-arid and the Gangetic plain populations were enriched with neurotoxic three-finger toxins, whereas, surprisingly, the population from the desert had very limited amount of this toxin type. However, its venom was enriched with cytotoxic or cardiotoxic variants of three-finger toxins. Significant differences were also noted in the venoms of the Russell's viper populations. We also documented considerable differences in biochemical activities, as well as their abilities to exert various pharmacological effects on humans. However, in the interest of time, I will skip these. The differences in the proteomic composition as well as activity had a profound effect on their toxicity. Populations that were found to be enriched with neurotoxic three-finger toxins were clearly the most potent. The desert population, which had very limited amounts of these toxin types, was extremely less potent. The pan-Indian populations of the Russell's viper too exhibited considerable differences in their toxicities. The significant difference in the venom composition, activity, and toxicity had a huge implication on the effectiveness of snakebite therapy. Indian antivenoms are marketed to neutralize 0.6 milligrams of the venom per milliliter of the antivenom. The dotted line in this figure denotes this marketed neutralization potential. If these bars meet this dotted line, it means that the antivenom works as marketed and exhibits the said neutralization potency. Alarmingly, for the majority of the pan-Indian populations of the spectacled cobra, the Indian antivenoms exhibited very poor neutralization potencies, including a complete lack of neutralization against the desert population of the spectacled cobra, where the antivenom failed to protect mice that were injected with the venom of this population. Surprisingly, despite the Russell's viper exhibiting considerable differences in venom composition, activity, and potency, the Indian antivenom exhibited the marketed neutralization potential against the majority of the pan-Indian populations of Russell's viper. Fascinatingly, it appears that venom variation alone cannot be an accurate predictor for the preclinical effectiveness of antivenoms. In contrast to the pan-Indian populations of Taboya racelli, the venom of the North Indian population was ineffectively neutralized by the Indian antivenom. The antivenoms also failed against the spectacled cobra and another big four Indian snake species, the common krait. These findings very clearly demonstrate the preclinical failure of the Indian antivenoms in the majority of the country, particularly in regions that are most affected by snakebite. While we have demonstrated significant interpopulation differences in venoms across large distances, intrapopulation venom variation across smaller geographical scales remains under-investigated. Hence, we collected the venoms of the monocellate cobra in the eastern part of India. We sourced venoms from over 20 individual snakes within a sampling radius of 50 kilometers. In-depth characterizations of the venom proteomes, activities, and toxicity profiles revealed significant differences in venoms between individuals. Alarmingly, we also found that the antivenom exhibited differential effectiveness against venoms, while the Indian antivenom, which is not manufactured against the monocellate cobra, unsurprisingly failed to protect mice injected with the venoms. Thai antivenom, manufactured using the monocellate cobra venom, only conferred protection against one of the tested venom samples. This clearly demonstrates that given the extravagant molecular diversity in snake venoms, the antivenoms may work effectively against some individual snakes while failing against others. Although the big four Indian snake species are considered to be most medically important to humans, there are many other snakes that cause numerous deaths and disabilities in regions where they are found. Unfortunately, the Indian antivenom manufacturers do not produce a specific antivenom for the treatment of bites from these snakes, and the clinicians are forced to use the big four antivenom for the treatment of all snake bites. These antivenoms are not very effective in cross-neutralizing the toxicities inflicted by the neglected species of snakes. A lack of phylogenetic understanding has also impeded the development of effective snakebite therapy in India. This is particularly true in the case of the cryptic kraits of the Indian subcontinent. Snake species are not only identified using molecular phylogenetics, but also based on various morphological traits. In the case of kraits, one such trait is the number of scales on the dorsal side at the mid-body. Kraits with 15 and 17 dorsal scale rows, or DSRs, are found all across the peninsula India. Kraits with 15 dorsal scale rows are commonly referred to as the common krait, whereas the kraits with 17 dorsal scale rows are known by various names including the Sind krait, the Wahl's Sind krait, and the Wahl's krait. Their precise phylogenetic histories remain ununderstood. Therefore, we sampled venom glands, physiological tissues, and scales of 15 as well as 17 DSR kraits from Rajasthan, Maharashtra, and Karnataka. Reconstruction of the phylogenetic histories using both morphological as well as molecular characters very clearly demonstrated that the 17 mid-body dorsal scale row kraits found in Maharashtra are actually the same as the ones found in Pakistan, the Sind krait. Surprisingly, we also found evidence that the 15 DSR kraits in southern India are genetically distinct from the 15 DSR kraits in North India. We described a new species of krait in the southern part of the country and named it in the honor of Romulus Whittaker, the snake man of India. While it is very clear that there is a significant genetic divide between the kraits in the southern and northern part of India, it is not very clear who is the actual common krait. Is it the 15 DSR krait that is distributed in the majority of the country, the one that we are currently calling the common krait? Or is it the 15 DSR krait that we described as a new species in the southern part of India? What is certain is that it is a species complex, and there are multiple species of undescribed cryptic kraits in the Indian subcontinent. It was also quite apparent that this significant genetic divergence has a negative impact on the effectiveness of antivenoms. The antivenom failed to effectively neutralize the venoms of the 15 DSR kraits in the northern part of India. They also failed in neutralizing the venoms of both the Romulus krait as well as the Sind krait. All these studies have very clearly demonstrated the prominent role of ecology and evolution in shaping the venoms of India's medically most important snakes and the alarming repercussions of this variation on India's snakebite therapy. To address this problem, we are establishing the Indian Venom Research Unit, or IVRU, a first of its kind national center for snakebite research and education in India. IVRU will consist of a state-of-the-art serpentarium that will house a diversity of medically important snakes and other venomous organisms from all across India. Its research wing will facilitate the advancement of snakebite therapy in India with a particular focus on Karnataka. Several life-saving drugs have been designed from the venoms of snakes and other organisms. Unfortunately, this biodiscovery research in India has lagged behind the rest of the world. Therefore, IVRU will act as an incubation center and will house startups that will focus on venom research with a particular emphasis on biodiscovery aspects. In addition to bringing biotechnological innovations to the state of Karnataka, IVRU will inspire the next generation of India's herpetologists and wildlife biologists. IVRU is being funded by ITBT, the government of Karnataka, and is being set up in collaboration between the Evolutionary Venomics Lab at the Indian Institute of Science and IBAB, the Institute of Bioinformatics and Applied Biotechnology. IVRU will be set up on the campus of IBAB. Now let's tune into a panel discussion on snake bites moderated by Senji Lakshmi and Navneet Kaur.
Greetings to one and all. I'm Senji Lakshmi, a PhD research scholar from the Evolutionary Venomics Lab, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. I'm joined by my colleague, Navneet Kaur. We will moderate this session where we will discuss the neglected problem of snakebite in India with a particular emphasis on this socio-economic disease in Karnataka. We are joined by experts from various fields related to snakebite therapeutics, including scientific research, clinics, forest department, and public outreach. I take this opportunity to introduce our esteemed panel members. First, we have Mr. Gerard Martin, who is the founder and the director of the Liana Trust. He has been actively involved in wildlife research, education, and community-engaged conservation for over 2 decades. Jerry and his team have been working on finding effective and sustainable solutions for the mitigation of snakebite. We have Dr. Maya Gopalakrishnan, who is a clinician and an assistant professor at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Jodhpur, Rajasthan. She has contributed immensely in tackling clinical challenges associated with snakebite. She is focused on improving the clinical care for acute snakebite victims, especially during the COVID-19 crisis, and long-term care for the snakebite survivors. Ms. Deepika Bajpai is the Deputy Conservator of Forests at the Gadag Division and Executive Director at the Gadag Zoo. She is a proactive environmentalist who has worked towards sensitizing the masses about the significance of protection of wildlife and forest resources. She has initiated public participation in mass planting programs.
We also have with us Dr. K. Kemparaju, who is a professor in the Department of Studies in Biochemistry at the University of Mysore. He has extensively worked on snake venom pharmacodynamics and platelet biology. He and his team have characterized various venom toxins of therapeutic importance and proposed auxiliary therapies against systemic and localized toxicity. We also have Dr. Sanjay Ghosh, who is the Senior Assistant Professor at the Institute of Bioinformatics and Applied Biotechnology. His research focuses on developing translatable technologies and products using synthetic biology approaches for various diseases, including snakebite. Dr. Gopi Kadyala, he is the director of Kintox Biotech India Private Limited, a snake venom-based startup at Bangalore. He aims to develop monospecific snake antivenoms without the hypersensitive side effects. His team has also developed a unique diagnostic kit which helps in instantaneous identification of snake species through toxin detection. Last but not the least, we have Ms. Purti, who has been a project manager and snakebite educator at Havumattu Navu in Karnataka. She has worked closely with the rural populations to create awareness on snakebite and educate them about safety practices. Once again, we would like to everyone on the panel.
We'll start with our discussions. Our first question is to Mr. Gerard Martin. It is often said that prevention is better than cure. What is your take on creating social awareness to reduce the incidences of snakebite, and what are the major challenges in the mitigation of human-snake conflict?
Well, my take is that it needs to be done. I think one of the biggest challenges is how we do it. We've been talking about outreach and education for a long time, and there's a lot of it happening with different organizations or individuals around the country, in fact, and a lot happening in Karnataka, which is quite enthusing. But the big problem is, how do we do this effectively, and whether we are able to measure impact. So unfortunately, most of the outreach is measured by effort, and we don't know how much of an effect it's happening. And bringing science into education and outreach really needs to be concertedly done at the moment, because at the moment there isn't any yardstick for efficacy, or even like a qualitative control of what is being disseminated to the masses. There's a lot of opinion-based outreach that's happening, and not enough that's based in solid science.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, sir. Our next question is to Dr. Maya Gopal Krishnan. So my question is, the currently marketed antivenoms seem to be not very effective in many regions of the country. So as a practicing clinician who very frequently treats snake bite, have you encountered any cases where the clinical failure of antivenom was very much evident?
Yes, so I have practiced in a few places in India. Now I'm placed in Jodhpur, Rajasthan. So currently from where I'm working at AIIMS Jodhpur, it is a very big and almost a day-to-day problem, especially this year during the monsoons. It has been a very serious problem. As in, we have patients who are coming with envenoming, and they reach within maybe an hour or maybe within 2 hours very early, and they've received the full dose of antivenom, but there is no effect of antivenom. So we've been seeing this in hemotoxic bites, mainly Aedes bites, Aedes schurtschilii. We've been interacting over this with you guys also. So most of the Aedes schurtschilii bites, there is no response to antivenom. They bleed and they continue to bleed. Even with support, we have lost some patients this year. It's also, we've seen this in neurotoxic envenoming, specifically great bites. We hypothesize that this could be because of the regional variants of great, but we don't know that. We don't have evidence yet. But yes, it is a big burning problem, especially in areas like Rajasthan, where the ecology is a little bit different from the rest of the country. But I'm sure it's also a regional problem in various other places. And this is not just with one antivenom. We have changed few antivenoms, and we are facing this with most of the antivenoms, polyvalent antivenoms, which we use.
Yeah, definitely, ma'am. We definitely need a different product for regions where the ecology is very different. Our next question is to Ms. Deepika Vajpayee. Ma'am, while the snakebite problem leads to loss of human life, it also continues to pose a serious threat towards the conservation of snakes. How does the Forest Department tackle this issue, and what measures are being taken to protect the snakes?
So, Sanjeev, what happens is, most of the snakes which are rescued are forest areas. If you look at the kind of rescue calls that we get, it is mostly from the areas adjacent to the protected forest or from the urban areas. So how do we come into picture then? What happens is, there are very few, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 certified snake catchers, wherein they regularly interact with the department. Otherwise, most of these people, most of the boys and the village dwellers and all, they themselves learn this art of snake catching, which is not scientific. They catch these snakes. Usually they either pack them in bottles or polythene bags and throw wherever they feel like, or if they come in touch with the department, then we tell them where to release those snakes. Generally, we try to release those snakes in the natural habitat of the snake. But mostly, because these are all shortcuts, we have seen occasions where we have found a lot of snakes packed in an airtight box or in polythenes. And these are all very, endangered snakes, which you don't see often. So that is one issue which we as department are facing because of jurisdictional issues. So only protected forest areas, statutory forest, come under our jurisdiction directly. Any area outside protected forest either belong to the revenue department, they come to the panchayats or the municipalities, or they come to the urban local bodies. How do we picture in them? So with Mr. Gerard also, last time we had some discussions. So we really have to train people, first of all, how to rescue snakes. And once when they rescue snakes, where those snakes have to be released. That is very important. So something like proper documentation, where they have caught the snake, which variety was it, what was species identification, a picture of the snake, and where you have released. Even if this data is streamlined, we will go a very long way in conservation of snakes. That is what is missing right now, and department is working towards it, but we are a very, very far away from the real efforts.
Thanks so much, ma'am. That we definitely agree with it. Our next question is to Professor Kemparaju. The venom composition varies significantly from one snake to another, as we all know. So this is one of the major challenges that limits the design of a single antivenom product for the whole country. So what are the possible strategies to overcome this challenge, which you would like to suggest?
Yes, we can think of several strategies to improve the antivenom therapy. First and easiest strategy would be developing or dividing our country into at least 5 to 6 snake bite sensitive regions, and then going for region specific polyvalent antivenom production. This is a straightforward thing and appears much easy to practice. And the second strategy would be developing diagnostic kits for snake specific for specific snake venom, diagnose the bitten species, and then go for specific monovalent antivenom therapy. Again, this is not going to be that easy. We have to precisely develop kits for individual snake venoms, and that needs a lot of lab and field work. And the third strategy would be to go for reverse pharmacology, where we can think of target guided antivenom therapy. We know all snake venoms would target 3 vital systems such as nervous, muscular, and hemostatic system. So correspondingly, we have neurotoxicity, myotoxicity, and hemotoxicity. So based on this, generate target-specific monoclonal antibodies that would efficiently neutralize individual lethal property. Make a concoction or a mixture of monoclonal antibodies and use the concoction throw it in as a common antibody for all snake bites. This method appears logical, highly efficient, and promising to practice. But believe me, it's not as simple as we think, because snake venom toxicity itself is very complex. We have not even understood the in vivo toxic role of so-called non-toxic venom components in venom. So far, based on in vitro studies, we claim many components as non-toxic, but that is not true. Further, non-toxic components also vary from venom to venom. So many things have to be understood before venturing into making a target-guided antivenom. So this is what.
Yes, sir, definitely. Yeah, we will speak more about how the non-toxic components are also important.
Because we are ignoring all those non-toxic components.
Yes. Yeah, certainly. Our next question is to Dr. Sanjay. Given the complexity of snake venoms, we will definitely need advanced therapies and advanced technologies to be implemented to develop a snake bite therapeutics. So our next question is something related to that. Synthetic biology has played a vital role in the development of drugs to treat life-threatening diseases, including cancer. So could you please tell us how synthetic biology can be useful in developing better snake bite therapies, given the complexity of snake venom?
Yes. First of all, thank you for giving this opportunity. So we all understand that there are several challenges in the current envenomation treatment strategies, and there are certain limitations because currently it is kind of one size fits all. That means there is an anti-sera for all kinds of venoms, and as Professor Kemparaju correctly mentioned, that it is not highly effective. Also, it has high cost of production, and there is not much variability in terms of the whole repertoire of treatment strategies available. So synthetic biology actually has helped, as you mentioned, in other areas. And in this case, the novel approaches can include making recombinant antibodies with very high affinities against specific toxins, which Professor Kempra, you said that target-oriented or target-dependent antibodies. So such antibodies now can be made even multivalent, because nowadays antibody engineering is possible. And one can, in fact, once they identify a given high specific activity, a kind of epitope, then that can be engineered as well. So there, the synthetic biology field can definitely help. Antibody engineering has also been done to improve the thermal stability. So the storage, etc., of course, antibodies can be done pretty easily. So these are kind of a biased approach, which will help in not only making the antivenom strategies more reproducible and high efficiency or high efficacy, rather also make it more accessible to people. But recently there are, I mean, for the last few years, some unbiased approaches are also coming in the field, and which includes making synthetic peptides. So there are Phage displayed synthetic peptide libraries available, and one can in fact look at, first identify the most potent lethal factor in a venom, and then use that as so-called a bait to find a high affinity binder using these synthetic peptides, and thus use them now to engineer a given cocktail of a product which can be targeted, again, highly specifically, possibly having a low immunogenicity and low toxicity. So these are some of the approaches I think will come in the future, and this will need active collaboration between people who are working on the field, as well as what we know of the venom and how to engineer biologics to make better envenomation strategies.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ghosh. It was really interesting to hear this. My next question is to Dr. Gopi.
Yes, I can.
Ma'am, you're there? Yeah, sir. Yeah, hello. Yeah, sir. Can you please explain us how Ayurveda or herbal medicine can be useful for treatment of snake bites? In your opinion, can they be completely replaced by the current generation antivenoms?
So when these traditional medicine or herbal medicine, we have been using it from ages. Even in fact, before even producing the first anti-snake venom, we have been using these plant-based medicines. But over the period of time, these anti-snake venoms, the antibody-based anti-snake venoms, has dominated the plant-based therapeutics. So because of multiple reasons. But at this point of time, what I could say here is that these plant-based medicines will act as a link between the bitten area or the bitten patient to the hospital. They can work as a complementary to the anti-snake venoms, but they can never replace the anti-snake venoms as such. That's what I feel. So as a next generation of anti-venoms or therapeutics, what I suggest people is to not focus on adding up one more plant to the database of the anti-snake venom plants. Instead, try to do what is available. With available information, what are we trying to coming up? Because till date, there is no clinical data and the human efficacy data for any of these small molecules, particularly for the snake bite. So why don't we put together all the available information and come out with the product? Because at the end of the day, not for the research or not for the publications, what is needed is a product to save the lives. So I think I call people to work in those lines so as to bring the product into the market. Yeah.
That's very correct, Dr. Gopi. But as you mentioned on those lines, it's not about what the scientist thinks, it's about what is needed in the market, which also means that there should be more communication with the rural communities who either practice this kind of herbal medicines or traditional therapies, or the people who actually experience snake bites. So Ms. Purti, as someone who has extensively worked with the rural communities, what changes in the policy decisions or in the communication decisions do you think is important and would be helpful in prevention and mitigation of snake bite problem in the country, particularly in Karnataka, as you have extensively worked here?
Yeah, so basically having worked very closely with rural communities for over a year now, what I've experienced is when I talk to a farmer or a children for that matter, the first thing when I ask them, like, what would you do in case of a snake bite? Most of them would respond saying, probably we would go to a local healer, regional healer. Never, not even like 80% of them, we have the data for that. So 8 of them don't treat snake bite as a medical emergency, while it has to be. So it's very important for us to address this issue, because whatever the research that we do, anti-venom survey, whatever it is been done so far, at the end of the day, if it doesn't reach the rural communities who are most prone to snake bite, I don't think it's of any, it makes any sense. So that's why we started working very closely with the rural community, educating them about the snake bite first aid, and first of all to avoid snake bite. And having come across so many incidences where they don't treat snake bite as a medical emergency, and after doing our awareness program with a lot of interactive materials, movie screening, and all of these things, we have measured that awareness definitely plays a very important role. So we have taken data wherein before and after our survey, and it's really shocking to see, a lot of them have responded very positively after the awareness program. And considering the population of our country and the scale that we are doing the programs, it's definitely not very easy to tackle this problem. We also need to do this in a mass thing, like, we need to involve media in this. We need to involve, the education curriculum itself is wrong. Like, if I just read a lesson where the snakebite first aid was taught. It was in 9th standard physical education textbook, which is circulated all across Karnataka. In that particular thing, they still go through this wrong first aid thing. They still have not updated that the protocol which has been approved by WHO. So there are a lot of things that we need to address at the very basic level. So I think it's very important to focus on their needs. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Spurti. Hopefully changes will happen soon. The next question is to Mr. Jerry Martin. Sir, in your experience, what possible measures can help avoid or minimize the snake-human conflict?
The fundamental thing is to actually understand conflict as a concept. Most people look at the presence of a human and the presence of an animal as conflict. It's not synonymous. Conflict actually happens when there is threat to either the person or to the animal, be it fatal death or morbidity or whatever, or if two parties are competing for the same resource. Now, the fact remains that neither is happening on its own when it comes to snakes. So if you think about in rural India, so I live here, and we're working constantly with people. We're also tracking Russell's vipers within an agricultural landscape, and we've been able to track verticals that maximize risk. And one of the biggest risks happen when people actually don't think about what they're doing. And it's difficult for a farmer to, especially in the tropics, to be able to focus constantly when he or she has to harvest all day, or plant all day, or weed all day. By the end of it, fatigue sets in, and when they're not looking carefully at what's around them, where they're putting their hands, where they're putting their legs. There've been a lot of solutions that have been suggested, from things like gumboots to using various devices. None of these have been tested, unfortunately. With a couple of projects that have actually studied the efficacy of these things have shown that people don't end up using gumboots for very long, or devices get spoiled, or those kind of things. So it's not, none of these are actually long-term solutions. In urban areas, the conflict generally comes from the human side, because people just want to remove snakes, whether there is risk or not. So understanding risk is really important, and understanding conflict is really important. So rescuers or anyone need to first look at whether there is need to so-called rescue. The other big problem is when you move a snake, it almost invariably dies. Every piece of research has shown that. Rescuers who know this continue to move snakes, including completely harmless snakes. And the problem with that is people aren't forced to adjust. If if we constantly remove, at least in our minds, remove the problem, then there is no learning that's happening. There's no building of skill. There's no working towards empowering people to live with snakes. As a child, I remember seeing an old lady in our village sweep a cobra out of her house and carry on with her work. Her grandson, I keep telling people the story, her grandson can see a tiny little keelback and he'll start screaming and call a rescuer and all these kind of things. So in my opinion, rescuers have actually worked towards the detriment and created more conflict than anything else, because people aren't comfortable with snakes. I think it's very, very easy. The problem is it's not now skill building, it's now mindset level change that has to happen. And it can only happen by example. And unfortunately, the most visual example is that of rescuers catching snakes, releasing them somewhere else, and then patting themselves on the back. Unfortunately, that's not a good thing, and they're patting themselves on the back without any reason.
Yeah, certainly. That the rescuers themselves are becoming a threat rather than actually solving the problem. So like you mentioned, the mindset of the people is another important thing, right? So this mindset in the way they see the snake or the way they approach the snake bite treatment, as Stuti mentioned. So Dr. Maya, could you please tell us how the mindset of the people actually affects, and what are all the prominent challenges that you face while treating snake bite cases?
Okay, so yeah, from that perspective, I think I can put it into three broad headings. The one is this point which Spurti as well as Gerard Martin has brought up, that there needs to be more community awareness. I don't know whether it's just awareness. So the one problem which we commonly face is late presentation. So patients don't treat it as medical emergency, as Spurti has rightly mentioned. So they come in late, they first go somewhere else, or they just stay home, or sometimes, or they go to traditional faith healers. So this is not about blaming the community or blaming the patients. And I'm not exactly sure whether it's just about creating awareness and knowledge, because many times you see that the knowledge part is there. And many times these people are educated also. They know that they need to come to the hospital. So it's something more of what is happening in the society and what is accepted at that point. So they kind of get pressurized into going to the faith healer, or they think something which, so this dichotomy is very difficult to understand, but it contributes to delay. And the practices like tourniquet, or maybe making a cut on the wound. So these things lead to infectious complications, losing of limb. So and these are done by urban people. It's not just people in rural settings who don't have the knowledge. So yes, awareness is important, but I think somewhere we need to go deeper into the community to understand where that awareness practice gap is coming in. The second one, which I've already mentioned, is a clear-cut clinical challenge. Like patients come and we don't have anything in our arsenal. Patient comes with malaria, we have at least a few things in our arsenal, but it's not that way for snake bite. Or whatever you have in your arsenal is not working. So that is a very helpless situation. So that is the second problem, which is very clearly clinical. Here again, yes, we need better products, but I also think we need better understanding of the pathophysiology in the human body itself. We don't know how venoms act. I'm sure this topic, Senji has also been mentioning, maybe the non-venomous components, which we call so-called non-venomous, and this in vivo studies also need to probably come in preclinical apart from the clinical trials. And the third, I think, is a kind of a researcher's perspective, but also a clinician's perspective. There is a big lacuna of evidence. So if I want to treat some patient with, say, HIV, I have a huge body of evidence. It's like in other places, there is so much evidence that I need to sift through, look at, okay, this is what I need to read. But in snake bite, there is a big lacuna of evidence everywhere, starting from what do you do for community engagement, what do you do for prevention, what do you do for first aid, what do you do for therapeutics. So I think evidence generation, clinical, preclinical, everything, these are needed for a clinician. So three major challenges: community awareness, late presentation, clinical challenge, our arsenal not working, and third is evidence gap. I think that is kind of summarizes it.
Thanks so much, Dr. Maya. There are many questions which are unanswered still. My next question is to Ms. Deepika Bajpai. Ma'am, the Indian government has really stringent laws instituted for wildlife conservation, which makes it a bit difficult to collect snake venoms or tissue samples. Can you please throw some light on how India can continue to effectively protect its wildlife while also facilitating scientific research in advanced areas that often require invasive sampling?
Navneet, that's a question which my higher ups will be more efficiently able to answer because it is more of a policy issue. But
I understand.
but still being in the bureaucracy, what happens is at present the extant laws and regulation that we would not be able to discuss because Wildlife Act is very stringent and it is really difficult to decide where to draw a line. So once you open up these areas to scientific research, we really do not know to what extent we can allow. So that is one thing. Second thing is, like Dr. Maya said, not just regarding lack of evidence in the clinical aspect, also from the conservation point of view. We really do not know our habitats well. We do not know which snakes are predominant where. There are so many subspecies which are being discussed, and we are still debating at the species level. So, like I said, we have a large number of rescue happening from the non-protected areas. And then these snakes, we do not know where they are released, how they are being released, and if the snakes survive post-release. So that can be a very important field where research can take up before entering into the protected areas, because most of these areas are overlapping. We have a lot of these agricultural landscapes and other buffer areas which do not belong to wildlife areas, and the snake keep coming out. So these kind of interface areas can actually help in scientific research. And secondly is our zoos are actually playing a larger role nowadays. Most of the zoos are aiming for conservation breeding programs, and they are aiming for larger scientific research. So if we can even, start breeding the snakes, if we want to get into scientific research. So I think rather than discussing if we can get into the protected areas and how we get into research on those scale, we can think of areas which are adjoining the research, the wildlife areas. And if we can take up some program in the zoos so that they become a center of learning. But how to go about the scheduled animals in the Wildlife Protection Act, that would be too premature for me to answer right now. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So actually, the government of Karnataka, I think, has been taking a lot of measures to come forward and connect this gap between research and the stringent wildlife laws. So we believe that the R&D center that will be coming up will solve a lot of issues that is there and act as a bridge between research and the wildlife laws. On the lines that we've been speaking about how there are a lot of so-called non-toxic components which are also medically relevant or medically important. Professor Kemparaju, could you please give us more information on that? Like, we know that the compositional complexity of snake venom toxins is remarkable. And your research has also highlighted that even minor components of venom such as nucleotidases and hyaluronidases could be clinically important, even though we call them non-toxic. What therapeutic solutions do you think can offer complete protection against the lethal and morbid effects of snake bite?
Yeah, I think right now with this background, whatever the information that is currently available with that background, it's difficult to say they are precise therapy for the management, considering let's say hyaluronidases or nucleotidases. But the thing is that although snake venoms have been subjected for extensive characterization, people so far focused much on toxic components, especially like the toxins that target vital systems, especially like neurotoxicity, myotoxicity, or cardiotoxicity, like that. But they really ignored non-toxic component. But the basic question would be, since the venom is basically evolved to immobilize, kill, and to digest the prey, why the venom has non-toxic components in it? That means to say, venom being a mixture of so many components, definitely even what we say non-toxic components, because we have not really characterized them properly. For example, hyaluronidases and deoxyribonucleotidases. I think earlier to 2002, people did not work much on these enzymes. I think it's our lab for the first time characterized hyaluronases as toxins. They're more toxic than even any other toxins because they can convert a non-toxic venom into a toxic venom or non-lethal venom into a lethal venom. So also your DNases. DNases, again, people thought it could be hyaluronases or DNases. People earlier thought, they're just non-toxic and play a digestive role. But, beyond digestive role, nobody has thought of. In 2014, probably, if I remember correct, I think again, the role of DNase we discovered for the first time in our laboratory. And DNase is, if you isolate DNase and inject into mouse in terms of even grams together, it is non-toxic, non-lethal. But in venom, it makes the venom, so its presence makes the venom, whether it, it can convert the venom into a lethal or into a non-lethal one. It can play a role in local toxicity. It can also play a role in systemic toxicity. So also hyaluronases. So these components, so far we have ignored them. So for making a potent antivenom for the treatment, these ignored non-toxic components have to be considered thoroughly, have to be studied thoroughly. That's what I would like to say.
Thanks so much, Professor Kemparaju. Our next question is to Dr. Sanjay Ghosh. Sir, this is another aspect of venom. So while venom toxins cause life-threatening pathologies, we have also seen several life-saving drugs which have been developed from the venoms. The possible COVID drug candidate from venom was in the news recently. It would be great if you could comment on the biodiscovery potential of the venoms, where certain properties of venom can be harnessed for making the life-saving drugs.
Yes, so venom definitely is poisonous, but there are good properties which has been used, not recently, but even it is mentioned in Ayurveda et al., that it has been used for some medical solutions as well. So I think one of the problems that we have currently is that we know less than 5% of the compounds in a venom mix of all kinds of toxins. Not just snake venoms alone. So there's a huge scope in learning, as Professor Kemparaju was also saying, is to know what kind of compounds are there and how they can be useful for treating medical conditions. There are already some success stories where small peptides have been used as an antithrombotic factor or even to treat cancer. So those can be applied to certain tumors like prostate and breast cancers and have been found to have reduction in the tumor growth. So we don't understand fully the mechanism of action. In some cases, they are small peptides which are mimetics of a given target. But a lot of work needs to be done in terms of learning more about the composition of the poisons and the venoms, and then how these can be used for therapeutic purposes as well. So I really feel and I believe that a lot of venom components can give rise to a new generation of drugs which can solve the problems of modern day life, including cardiovascular conditions, antimicrobial resistance, and to name just a few. So this will become more and more common as we learn more and more about the different properties and the composition of the venom, I believe.
Thank you, sir, for giving a completely different perspective about venoms. Another thing that we have not spoken here during this discussion is about the problem of detecting which snake has bitten the patient, right? This is a problem that clinicians often face. And even though it is not currently needed because we have only one antivenom, it would always be good to have a foolproof detection strategy so that we can use mono-specific antivenom. So Dr. Gopi, since you're working towards the development of snakebite diagnostic kits, can you explain us how these kits aid in the treatment of snakebite in India?
Yeah, thank you. So the snakebite diagnostic kits, so they play a major role for the clinicians to choose which antivenom to be given. So So there are two scenarios where these kind of kits will help us for clinicians, whether before even go for the treatment, whether they should identify whether it is a poisonous or non-poisonous before even starting the treatment. So once you identify it as a poisonous, definitely we have this polyspecific antivenoms to be administered. That is one scenario. The other scenario where you have plenty of monospecific antivenoms, and if a clinician or the doctor has to be forced to choose which one to be administered. In that case, this anti-snake venom diagnostic kits will help clinicians to choose the better one for the prompt recovery of the patients. So in addition to this, generally, so in India, we do not have any diagnostic kit as of now. The clinicians are purely depending on the clinical symptoms and the laboratory-based techniques. So connecting this gap, we at Kintox Biotech India Private Limited, we are trying to develop a diagnostic kit as a rapid kit, so which will be able to identify the bitten snake species in less than 5 minutes. So that some of the trials are happening, and we're hoping to release them soon.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gopi. My next question is to Ms. Purti. Since you have worked a lot with rural populations from 1 year, as you mentioned, so what measures do you think the government of Karnataka should take to tackle the problem of snake bite?
Yeah, so like I already mentioned, one is definitely the curriculum. So we've already written to the board of textbook committee to update that first aid, whatever they mentioned. And secondly, coming back to the socio-economic condition of the people who are getting bitten by a snake. So definitely they can't afford a treatment. And that's why a lot of them, go in search of these regional healers or local remedies. So if the the current compensation that includes 2 lakh compensation for people who die due to snake bite. What I suggest is if the treatment cost is included in this compensation, probably then a lot of people will be drawn, towards the hospital than going to a local healer. So point number 2 is that. And the third thing is definitely media. Media plays a very important role, like how we tackled coronavirus, like we started practicing, personal safety habits like wearing masks, sanitizing regularly, and definitely providing free vaccination in the government hospitals. Likewise, even for snake bite, if we start, in a large scale, start speaking to people about the personal safety habits and about the medical emergency thing, and treating snake bite as a medical emergency and providing the right treatment, probably even for the free of cost, especially for farmers and other people who are having problem in getting a treatment done. So it's a collective thing. If all of these things happen, probably then we can think of reducing snake bite. So this is what I think the government of Karnataka can do, and which is very much possible for them to do. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, certainly. The government of Karnataka has already been envisioning a lot of positive things towards the snakebite problem. Dr. Ghosh, are you with us? Can you say a couple of lines about the R&D center that is going to come up and how that will help in the snakebite problem for the Karnataka level?
Yes, so I can briefly mention that which in collaboration with Dr. Karthik Sunagar's lab at ISC and at IBAB, the government of Karnataka is funding setting up a Venom Research Institute, which will not only be for research, but also for public communication and engaging people, and all the points that we discussed today in this panel. And for that, it's a 3-year grant to start, 5-year grant from the government of Karnataka, and the institution will be in the campus of IBAB. Yeah, in a couple of years, I think the construction, etc., will be completed, and then we'll fully start the activities of breeding snakes. And also we are starting collaborating on working on new synthetic approaches to treating snake bites as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much for briefing us on that. We are hoping that will change this scenario in Karnataka, and Karnataka will be a model for the other states and other regions where we can replicate a similar strategy. And I would like to thank all our panelists who took their precious time to join us here and share your opinions. We have experts from various different fields, and we heard very different opinions about how we can tackle snakebite through different channels and modes. Thank you so much, everyone, again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a very exciting discussion. I'm happy to be a part of it.